At the beginning of the Gospel reading, it starts off, and then he continued on and said. The story the event that Luke records before the triumphant entry is the keepers of the vineyard that were wanted to take over and kick out the son, and ended up trying to kill the son of the vineyard. A parable that speaks of judgment and the impact of ignoring God. And then we have in this passage, after he said this, he went on ahead going to Jerusalem. What were people looking for outside Jerusalem that day? What were they expecting? The reading from Luke reminds us that they'd seen Jesus do miracles of people who could see, of injustices that were addressed, of balance of power that was lived out in a very different way in Jesus' life. What were they expecting to happen at that time? Now, the photo on the theme slide I want to show you, if we can just put that up, please. Now, we went out for dinner at the local cafe, and this was a couple of weeks ago when the sun was shining, and we walked out. This is before daylight saving, so whenever it was, and we walked out at something like about 6:30, and this is the sight we saw outside the cafe. So I took a photo with my phone and wished that I had had my camera with me. But it just really stood out to me, that reflection of the sky and the trees in the water. And the words that I put with it are from the reading. Christ himself was like God in everything, which comes from the Philippians reading. A few days later, we were walking past the same place in the middle of the day. The clouds were overcast and it looked very different. The water was rippling because the wind was blowing on it, and we couldn't really believe it was the same spot as what that photo. The opportunity there to see something and to see it looked differently because of the reflection in the water of what was above the water. What we expect to see and taking notice of what we see is really important. So as the people came to Jerusalem there and Jesus came on a donkey, what did they see? What were they expecting? And how did they interpret what they saw? Luke talks about the power of God at work in Jesus' ministry and life. The people were saying, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." They were praising God. And the Pharisees were saying, "You need to keep these guys under check because the Romans who are looking over at us won't be too happy if they think that Jesus is coming in to be crowned king." And Jesus said, "If they don't speak, the very stones will cry out." The things that we expect to see can sometimes stop us from seeing what's really there and what's being symbolised in the imagery. When Jesus was coming up to Jerusalem, he organised, this cult was organised beforehand, certainly not a symbol of power. And as he came into Jerusalem, people were hoping that God would come in and overthrow the Romans of the time, and that they would be set free and the kingdom would be made present in that place. Their expectations were affected by what they thought was going to happen. And there may be their disappointment because it didn't happen. The reading from Isaiah reminds us that while there are many places where in the Old Testament where it reminds us of the way that God is with us in our difficult times, where God is working out his purposes and plans for the world and for us, the passage about the suffering servant reminds us that there are times where things don't go easily. And the point of that suffering servant passage from Isaiah is that it's easy for people to think it's getting too hard and I'm just going to go off and do something else. But the message of the suffering servant is the servant continues on even though the results aren't evident at the time. They're willing to be faithful to what they believe God was saying to them and the way that God was leading them at that time. And that difficulties are not a sign that God is not with us or that God's plan is not going to happen. But it's part of that journey of life, and we can learn a lot in the midst of those difficulties. Because as part of our human experience is that we often learn the most when we're open to it. But also sometimes we learn more when things are hard going and we've got to work more at understanding what's happened than when things are going well and we think we're right in the crest of the wave and it's all going well. Some of our greatest learning happens in those times where we experience difficulty and disappointment and adversity in the midst of our experience. What do we see? What are we looking forward today? As we stand on the entry to this coming Holy Week, what is it that we are hoping God will do? Hopefully we've been aware at times of the power of God at work in our lives and the lives of people we know in the world. But what is it that we are hoping for this week as we approach Good Friday and the journey continuing on through Holy Week before we get to next Sunday? Jesus' way of expressing God's presence is through humility, through living out the love, the welcome, the healing that God offers the world and offers us. I found the Lewis the sheep story really helpful because, spoiler alert, I was looking for photos and I found this website that had some photos from the book, and I thought, well, I can use those to tell the story today. And it was saying that this all happened in Lewis's imagination. I hadn't even thought of that. I mean, it's obvious, but you know, as you're reading the story and thinking of the illusions and connections, you don't always think of some of that in depth, of some of the reality of that. In what's this book? What's this story? What's the author trying to say to us? And how often, when we feel that we're on top of things, do we feel that we should be associating with people that are successful rather than some of those situations that we would rather avoid? And how much is that like Lewis wanting to be with the people that are like him rather than the sheep who were different? And the way that in the other parts of the story that when I eventually get the book, I might even show you. He got lions brought in from a neighbouring country so he could go hunting, and he had this great palace, and all the great musicians came in to do recitals for him because he was king. It was all about him. Paul, in writing to the Philippians, is reminding us, particularly in the part of the reading just before the part Anne read for us today in the lectionary, in verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. It's not so easy sometimes, because sometimes we find it too easy to put ourselves down, and sometimes we're not even aware of when we are putting ourselves above others, or when we're disempowering other people by our actions. Some news stories recently about the slave labour and the clothes production, and that there aren't many clothes manufacturers that are actually not using some sort of slave labour in their production process. Even in some of the things that we buy and do can be part of an oppression and injustice in our world. These are things that Jesus would be saying to us and reminding us of as we think of this week, as we think of our lives and what God is saying to us. May we in this week be aware of what God is saying to us. May we look differently, look deeper, not only at what's happening around us, but what God is saying to us, what God is prompting within us, so that we might learn, so that we might grow through learning what it means to reflect the presence, the life, love of God in our world as Jesus did. And may our lives reflect God's presence, God's love in all we do as we journey through this week. Amen.